Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Jonas Altman, who is a founder, he's a facilitator, he's a coach. He's the author of Shapers, Reinvent the Way You Work and Change the Future. And he is also, like I mentioned, a coach with his firm is called Sphere. Jonas, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Will. Pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about your book Shapers first. So came out last year, right in the middle of the pandemic. There's just for listeners, why don't you give listeners just a little overview of the book? There's 3 parts to it: the meaning and nature of work, part 1; the part 2, the better ways of working, and part 3, principle for the futures of work. Give us a little bit of an overview of the book.
Sure. Well, funnily enough, you stuttered, or you said 2020, which for a lot of people it was like a blip year. So it came out last year, and last year in many ways changed how people perceive or experience time. Some people felt more time scarcity, and like all of a sudden they had no time to get anything done, whether it was homeschooling, working from home, etc., or that time slowed and they had lots of time. And so, never in a million years did I anticipate that the book would come out during a global pandemic. And the book touches on 3 parts, as you offered. The first is looking at how we got to the place that we're at and the changing nature of work. Very quickly, work as a one-way ticket to heaven, something that was often dirty or demeaning or drudgerous. And fast forward to today's, say, knowledge economy or innovation economy, where work is the principal place for many people where they find their sense of joy and meaning. So it tells that story rather quickly. And then it jumps into where we are and focuses on the individual and how to design your days and weeks and work life, teams and fluid teams at organizations that can come together, do great work, collaborate, and then disband, much like a jazz band or a sports team. And then organizations moving to either more autonomy and more self-management, or more hierarchy and more command and control. And then the last part is my attempt to predict the future, which I think is a fruitless or futile undertaking, but it offers some principles that might help navigate to a preferable future. So that's the overview.
Yeah. Tell me about some of those principles of navigating to the future. So there's 5 chapters on this: learning, feeling, leading, becoming, and futuring. So start anywhere in there. Tell us something you're thinking about how work may evolve.
Yeah. It's funny, I've done lots of podcasts and that question in that shape hasn't come up. And I think learning is a great place to start, which is forget about organizations, just talk about how we dealt with uncertainty and how we deal with change. And the first thing is we have to acknowledge that we need to mourn or grieve our identities or the way of working or the way of living that was, and then get excited and or adapt to what is or what is coming. And for a lot of people, that is disorientating and jarring and not really that enjoyable. So learning is actually moving from a Mr. or Mrs. Know-it-all and moving towards a Mr. or Mrs. Learn-it-all. And this is like showed up at some great companies. So you could look at the CEO of Google, who would ask questions like, how can I best serve you? What do we know? What don't we know? What are some other alternatives or possibilities? Instead of do this, we need to do this, we need to fire 30% of our staff. So learning is really a value that you value, I know, which is curiosity. So that would be that. The second one is this whole revolution we're seeing at work, whether it's Brene Brown or Esther Perel, championing taking off your professional mask and your armor and being more of a human, having more empathy, more collaboration, more openness. And we're seeing that, whether we like it or not, through the Zoom culture that has become the norm. And then leading, which is going through a major transformation, has been for some time, where now the leader is much more of a shaper, a facilitator, and even a coach, and wears multiple hats and is not just a manager or a boss. And that's both my opinion, but it's more and more becoming accepted. I don't want to say policy, but accepted sort of a truth that there are different ways of showing up. Becoming is moving beyond our individual little egos and looking at, like, what are we becoming as a species who has the ability to project into the future, reflect into the past, and really create resilient communities and a world that is a world that we would want to inhabit. And that's a whole kettle of fish when we look at universal basic income, if we look at what's happening in the Middle East, if we look at what's happening in India, or how different countries have reacted to COVID. I didn't anticipate all that, but it kind of scratches on, we don't have a world where enough people have quality work, if they have work at all. And futuring is falling off on that, of what are some alternative ways to not default to a future that isn't one we'd want to inhabit. It means we actually need to course correct or change, and the where to start, which is the subtitle of the book, is with ourselves. If we change our operating system or our mindset at the individual level to have more civic engagement, more trust and transparency in the workplace, then we might have some bandwidth to start addressing these problems.
Let's talk about learning for a little bit. What do you believe is true about learning in the future that not everyone would agree with, or that is maybe different from conventional wisdom?
Yes. Well, as you asked that question, I stood up because I am more kinesthetic in style. I like to move, to think and learn.
I love that. I love that you shared that. That's so awesome.
Yeah. And, you know, I have a nephew who's extremely gifted. He learns playing YouTube, learns piano by listening to, you know, Stevie Wonder on YouTube, and then just playing the song and feeling it. So he's a feeler. He's not so much of a thinker, although he is a thinker too. And I think the first place to start, which would be sort of some of the great work from Ken Robinson, that schools historically have batched us and hammered out a few principles: that everyone is creative, that failure is okay, and this idea of interpersonal communication, that if someone isn't feeling good, or if someone is in a difficult situation, that you have an opportunity as a child or as a youngster to avoid or to lean in. And we're not, at least I wasn't taught that. I was just sort of thrown into scenarios and based on my parenting or on my personality. But I think there's a whole world of knowledge and lived experiences that children in their formative years could, especially now, could be supported to say, you know, it's okay if you're sad, and not to hammer out, you know, oh, your drawing isn't as good as her drawing or his drawing. So I think the first principle or myth to debunk is that there's a creative person and a not a creative person, or that you can't fail your way to success or experiment as a child or as a youngster. Because if you ask anyone under the age of 5 or 6 to run, to dance, to draw, they typically do. But if you ask someone in their 30s, they might say, no, you know, I don't dance. Like, that's not my thing. So that maybe, you know, unpacking that a little bit is maybe our systems were designed in the image of a machine, and only with Montessori schools or situated learning are we getting more about the different types of intelligences that we have way beyond IQ and academic rigor.
Yeah. I want to share something on that,
yeah.
which you'll probably get a kick out of, Jonas, which is, I just took this survey for one of the local theater companies here in New York City. They were trying to figure out, how they should plan for reopening up. So they're asking, past audience members about their plans, right? And so long survey. And question 40 towards the end here was, do you earn a portion of your income from performing, teaching, or creating art of any kind? So I just thought that was such an interesting question for me. I mean, I'm a management consultant, right? But I answered yes to that question because I consider the work that I do art, which Seth Godin, I think, defines as any emotional labor that seeks to cause change in another person.
Beautiful.
So art is not, in my view, about painting or sculpting, but it's about emotional labor. But to your point about how some art so much has been driven out of us, or we're taught to believe that just there's select few people are creative and others are not, is profoundly sad that some people have that view.
I love that. What a great share. And it reminds me, as you were talking, something else that is very present for me, which is if learning or the banking system of depositing information in the student's mind for regurgitation on an exam was one way, that the learning of today, and perhaps always, should be active and direct. So, to your point, to be able to take a podcast, a book, a lecture, translate it and synthesize it, and then teach it to someone else and learn with the knowledge that that's what you're going to do. I'm going to read this book, then I'm going to share it with my colleagues or my kid, not because I was assigned a book report, and maybe even gift it to someone, and reading and consuming and learning with the knowledge that you are actually doing it not as someone who's hoarding, but whose duty is to share that knowledge. And so I don't know whose quote it was, but it's sort of sacrilegious to try and hoard and maintain the things back to our Mr. and Mrs. Know-it-all, but instead to add your own sort of will, perspective, or maybe even opinion, and that way it's much more alive. And I think that that's something that maybe was neglected or isn't as pronounced certainly in our schools.
Yeah. So outside of this context of schools and formal education, let's talk about learning as an adult. What is your thinking about, in terms of the principles for the future of work and kind of just ongoing adult learning? What are some of your thoughts about what people should be doing to take responsibility for their own ongoing education and learning?
The first one is to actually never think that it's done. And I think there's a few people who I've encountered in my career that somehow, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe it's conditioning, or they're just so bright that they are like, I'm good. Like, I don't need to learn about behavioral psychology, or I'm not interested in meditation. So we're back again to like, is curiosity a gene? Is it something you can cultivate? But to think that adult learning stops, and when you finish college or your graduate degree that you're done is to me is archaic. The second thing would be like the modalities of how you learn. Everyone learns differently. People have a preference for certain styles. Some people have blended learning. Most of us are becoming more and more visual learners, just out of necessity. So catering to how you learn, like understanding how you best learn, and being okay with that, is important as an adult. A lot of people that I've been working with like the drip. So instead of being bombarded with too much, suggested articles, links, lectures, videos, podcasts, but not dumping it. So for example, if I were to give you some music that I love, I could give you 1 gigabyte or 10 gigabytes on a USB drive. Or I could say, Will, I know you like jazz. Here's my 5 favorite jazz tracks. Have a go. Dance with them. So that kind of thing has been helpful. And then there's another woman that wrote a book. I don't know her name off the top of my head, but it's about systems thinking. And it talks about awareness. And as we self-author our lives individually, it becomes more increasingly interesting to look at, you know, collectives and interdependence. So thinking about how you might learn in a book group, in a book club, or how this conversation, or as we were talking about before, with maybe 3 or 4 people, can be much more rich, much more memorable, and become tacit knowledge that lives in us simply because we got to lean and depend on others to support us in our learning journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your point about ongoing learning and not relying on what you learned in school. I have this, I mean, I was a nuclear trained submarine officer before I became a consultant.
Wow.
So I approach some of this with kind of this nuclear mindset of thinking about learning about, there's like a half-life to the knowledge and the skills that you've learned. And it has maybe a half-life of something like 2 to 5 years, which means that, you know, the half-life is the length of time it takes for half of the material to be gone. So for uranium-235, it's, I forget, I don't know, 35,000 years or something crazy. I don't remember. But I think of it for like your education, I think of it as maybe like 2 to 5 years. So you get a degree, you know, 5 years later, maybe you have half of that value. And then another 5 years later, you have like only a quarter of it left. So if you want to really keep succeeding professionally, you have to keep replenishing that well over time.
Yes. I totally agree with that. And, you know, I was on a workshop this morning, and the fellow is a founder, and he's become a meditation coach. He went to Indonesia and studied Vedic meditation for 4 months. And in many ways, our minds are so busy and our attention is so fractured that to get back to a point where the well is either empty or has things of currency in our world, back to your comment about theater, is becoming like a real chore, or even something that's very intimidating for people because of our always on world of the inputs that never seem to be ending. And so to get back to a mindset or to an environment that is conducive to learning is also a challenge. So, you know, there's a whole maybe aspect to acknowledge of what are the fertile conditions for you to, you know, as you rightly said, like turn information into knowledge.
Yeah. Maybe 3 other things I'd say on this topic. It's one principle, I think, in terms of continuing ongoing learning is having an attitude that you want to get bad at something. So that's number 1. Yeah. So, which I mean by, like, if you have never played chess before, right? If you just have never even picked up a piece, you don't know the rules, then you're not even bad at chess, right? You're not even bad. Whereas in one weekend, you could learn the rules, you could have someone play 10 games with you, you get the hang of it and you have the idea, okay, there's king, pawn, etc. Now you're bad at chess, but that is like infinitely more knowledge of chess than before the weekend, right? So there's just this massive gap. To go from that level 1 to becoming the grandmaster, being Magnus Carlsen, okay, so that's another 30 years of effort. But, you know, just to go from 0 to 1, it's like a small step, but you have to have this mindset. It's okay, I just want to get bad at a lot of things. Yes. And then the next thing would be to have some kind of routine or ongoing habit that you integrate into your ongoing routine. So it's not just like, oh, occasionally you get all motivated and you sign up for a massively online course or some Udacity thing and, you know, and then just lose steam, but you need to embed it somehow in your ongoing practice. Whether that's like every morning you get up and you write for an hour, or maybe you do a podcast once a week, or you write a blog post and you've kind of committed publicly to some sort of schedule, would be, you know, another thing. So
Mm.
those are a couple of thoughts. Maybe it's, or you made some commitments to other people. Maybe you get together as a group and you commit to, like a reading, a book club or something.
Yes.
So I love your thoughts around this, about the, kind of thinking about the future of work. Let's talk a little bit about your coaching practice. I'd really love to hear kind of your approach of, what types of folks you primarily work with in terms of your clients, and what you work on with them.
Yeah. So there's this idea that certain people are in transition, and the footnote is like, who's not? Like, who isn't going through some sort of resurfacing, reemergence, reinvention? But when people feel, in terms of their own story, their own narrative, that they're crossroads, that the point they're at, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in their work, whether it's in the city they live in, something in them is stirring. And so usually they show up, or I'm attracted to them at the point where it's become very acute. They have like an acute state of acute case of transition, and that often has the lens of work. Yet it's not really work that is the thing. It's a dissatisfaction or a yearning to finally do what is, um, basically a creative itch, or a form of expression. Back to your Seth Godin, and so if I had to batch it with like categories, you have founders, so people who are running their own show and their own business with lots of autonomy, but also a lot of pressure. It's career changers, people who are imminently hitting eject out of one organization into something new, or job crafters, people who are in a work environment that is okay, but they believe, either through their relationships, their colleagues, their boss, or possibly the actual tasks, maybe the department or the kind of work they're doing, that there's a way to reshape their job so it's one they love. And that tends to be my client base.
Interesting. Okay. When you're working with any of these groups, but maybe we think about founders, do you have some kind of like, what's your rhythm with them? Do you kind of, is there some periodicity where you meet, check in, and is there a template for that meeting that you like to follow, of looking at their calendar, reviewing, their commitments, talking about what's working well? Like, how do you engage?
Yeah. I mean, every coach has a different style. There's a great analogy would be, a concept that's offered by Alan Watts about certain types of people. So some people typically are a bit more gooey and okay with uncertainty and can dance in the unknown. And some people are a little bit more prickly and love systems and structure. And I have all sorts of different people in my life that fit into those categories. But the caveat is that sometimes the gooey people need to become more prickly, and actually do. And other times the people who are more prickly become a little bit more gooey. So my coaching style is really dancing with the client in a way that resembles like jazz. So they come with the agenda, back to what we had spoken about. My agenda is to help them get out of their own way and to flourish as a grand agenda, but I put it aside. And so we jump in where they want to, which usually is, sometimes it's a trigger, sometimes it's them just talking and expressing stuff that's going on, and I can deduce that there's an irritation or there's an invitation of where to start. And then we typically converse for 45 to 50 minutes. My coach that coaches me, we go for 2.5 hours, but he's a philosopher. So that's a whole other kettle of fish. And within the last 10 minutes, instead of the conversation just sort of ending, we move into what coactive trained coaches would call the challenge phase, where it's about a request or a challenge that is going to, much to your point, create some form of accountability, not necessarily to the coach, not necessarily to that person's wife or husband or colleagues, but to that person, to themselves. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write every day. I'm going to launch my podcast by next week. So that can follow the grow model, which is a very popular model of goals, reality, opportunities, and a wrap. I don't necessarily follow that model so clearly. However, I'd say the idea that you could check in with someone every other week to every 4 to 6 weeks seems the right rhythm in terms of frequency. And the duration seems to be a half an hour on the short end up to say 2 hours on the long end. And the idea, obviously, is to create not dependability, and nothing against management consultants, because I know you are one, but there is a history of creating dependency with some of the big firms versus reliability and creating inner resources and internal capabilities within that individual to solve their own problems.
Mm-hmm. What do you, I'm curious about, obviously keeping everything sanitized, if you could share a story of one of your clients that set, an ambitious goal and achieved it, whether it was, launching some creative endeavor or not. And then maybe another person that like has not, maybe made progress on what they were hoping to do. And if you see some themes between that are common around people that, that are able to achieve these, aspirational targets.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with someone who didn't or hasn't yet kind of got to where they want to get to, or at least start that journey.
Okay.
Then we can end with, or we can move on to the person who has and is just like rock star. So this person is highly creative, and not that people aren't, but in terms of like actually is creating art, like visual art and so forth. And for whatever reason, found themselves in a job and in a career that ticks only a few boxes for what it is that excites them or lights them up. So they come into my world from either seeing that I'm doing what it is I love, or believing that somehow I can help unlock that part of them that they haven't unleashed, or maybe is a little bit dormant, just waiting to be activated.
Mm.
And so we start the process, and the themes typically, at least in the last couple of years, or certainly in the last year, have been time scarcity. I don't have the time. That's creating some sort of dis-ease in me, anxiety, and therefore I'm stressed. And so, like, without getting too detailed, like, removing that, or at least addressing that, then you're kind of stacking more on that by saying, well, actually, in addition to all the things you're doing, including parenting and your job, now you need to find time for this whole new activity, which in many ways is a whole other full-time job.
Mm.
Like, is that really going to happen? So we look at alternatives, we look at how to create some space, we look at tiny habits. And what ends up happening, and actually it's funny enough because I don't know if this is true or not, because I haven't spoken to them, but I will be speaking to them very soon. They, in many ways, have the picture in their mind. They have the roadmap, maybe even written out. Yet there is still a resistance. And it can be either, I would say, it could be a lot of things, but it can either be responsibilities to others and or resistance, being caught in their own shadow, or in their own, being in their own way. And it might just take more time. So instead of taking 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, it might be a sort of 3-year kind of change management project to get that person to acknowledge that they have a lot of work to do to get to a point of feeling time abundance and that they are being their most creative self, or at least giving life to that parts of themselves. So I'd say that that one is one that maybe it's, you know, a combination of a bunch of things. I didn't necessarily see the change and transformation that I would have liked, if that's one way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
The other scenario is someone who is in a job, studying part-time, family, COVID hits and things change drastically, and you know, work and life become basically one. And turns out that, long story short, quits his job, goes back to an old job with new energy, and ends up running for public office, and becomes a more present parent, and finds time for running and for golfing. And in some ways, his operating system seems completely different. Like it was night and now it's day, or it was day and it's night, from what it was when he started. And the transformation was really because, when you say people are coachable, he was dead serious about making progress, about doing the work, about addressing what he was really looking to do when he came into my stratosphere. And I'm just floored by it. Like in some ways, the relationship ended amicably in terms of we became friends, and now I just sort of sit on the sidelines in awe. And we do like, every other month or every 3 months we'll do a coaching call or a check-in. So that would be, a success story in terms of just needing a sounding board, or needing to expose blind spots, or just having an accountability partner. And the coach can be all of those things.
Yeah. Just beyond the purely professional, how do you work with a client that says, is beyond purely professional, sit at your desk type things, someone says, look, I really feel that I need to improve my diet and improve my sleep habits, and, wake up earlier, stop wasting time on XYZ on social media. To what degree would you get involved in those sorts of habit changes?
Yeah. So if we look at designing our support systems so that we have people in our lives, regardless of their denomination, of their title. So your wife might play a role as your emotional co-regulator, and your therapist might help unpack the past, and your coach might poke you and provoke you to step into a higher self, and your best friend might challenge you on the basketball court. Each of those people could show up in a way that you kind of expect them to, or at least give them permission to show up that way, because that's how they shine. So for me, I'm not really interested in helping people shape their diet. I'm interested in them being healthy and perceiving that they're mentally fit and physically fit. But if their goal is to get abs, then they got to go to some Instagram or some fitness pro who specializes in washboard stomachs. But when it comes to like healthy habits, like morning rituals, meditation, walking, running, and things that we know are necessary for knowledge workers to unwind and even to be creative, then I just offer suggestions. And I go, okay, so do you have a current practice? So yesterday, the fellow was like, I haven't really been doing anything. I just work all around the clock. And when I'm not working, I'm thinking about my company. I was like, okay, well, we know what's going on there. Like, you're a workaholic. You are doing this to prove something to some people or to yourself. What habits do you have? And he's like, well, I used to run, but now I'm walking. So now we start with the walking. Okay, how often are you walking? He's like, 2 or 3 times a week. I was like, okay, what would it look like to make that a daily practice? Or what would it look like to jump that up to 5 days a week, or longer walks when you go for those 2 or 3 walks, and just meet them where they're at.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then obviously today's world, coaching is one of the fastest growing professions, which is why in many ways there is a perception, as well as some snake oil sales people. There's a side of it as like life coach, performance coach, mindset coach, relationship coach. And, those titles to me are somewhat arbitrary, in that I'm going to show up as the person I am with the energy I have. I'm going to not solve your problems, but take it that you're naturally creative and resourceful and whole. And if that doesn't work for you, then I'm not your coach. And I'll happily recommend you to someone else or tell you to go on your merry way. That's taken me a long time to get to because my default programming is a people pleaser. So I want to please every client and make everyone happy. And that's futile. That's actually, very dangerous. So we start there a lot when I look at the saboteurs that show up for people.
Mm-hmm.
The saboteurs tend to be the inner critic, the procrastinator, the perfectionist, the imposter. They're usually the same version of a shadow self. And that person is doing the work to kind of say, hey, what are you, how are you serving me? Are you pushing me to do more and be more, or are you getting in my way and hindering me? And that part of the work, in addition to understanding what's important to someone, what their values are, how they can show up and make a contribution, those two kind of go hand in hand. One is your vision and your life purpose, and the other is the stuff and the muck that's holding you back.
Wow. Yeah. And I'm curious, like, what sorts of aspirations do you see people? Are there themes across that about what, is everybody really trying to do the same thing? Oh, I want to get more fit. I want to, have more time, or just what sorts of changes are you see people trying to make?
It's a great question. Personally, I think the themes are the same themes that have historically been there, at least in the sort of, post-industrial era, which is people want a sense of freedom. They want to feel autonomy and have agency. And whether they do or they don't is a big issue. And so that's about their cognitive framing of, am I free to work from home? Am I free to work on what I want to, where I want to? So that's a huge theme. Coupled with freedom is responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your colleagues. So that's a big theme. Another theme is like creative expression, which is part of Shapers. This idea that you had rightly said, like, if everyone is creative and you believe that, and there's different forms of creativity, how often do you get to flex those muscles? And we know that, if you say, I want to be an artist, like you could look throughout history, and there was very few poets. Like, I'm not sure T.S. Eliot ever said, I want to be a poet. He just was. So you kind of feel compelled to. And I feel like a lot of people are being called to or being seduced to express themselves in whatever way that could be magnified by social media and the internet. So that's another theme. And then, yeah, I guess the other one is the darkness, which is people, including myself, just don't give themselves permission to fail, either at all or to fail publicly. And that's a shame in some ways, but it also is something to acknowledge of what is it about our culture that has reinforced that you just have to all of a sudden be an expert or be a professional, and that to get to be a professional at some point you had to be an amateur. And we go back to my nephew. He's an incredible tennis player. I mean, he can, he's 9 years old. He can shove it down my throat, topspin, all of that. But when it comes to other sports, a couple of them he's just not interested in because he's not good at them. And I'm like, that's okay. You don't have to be good. You can be bad, like you said. And it's easy for me to say that as the uncle, but I'm wondering where else that shows up, whether it's the workplace or even in family life, around like, oh, I just don't, I'm not good at cards. I can't play, or I'm not good at chess. So that to me is another thing of like, how would you know if you weren't willing to prototype that version of yourself and try it on?
Yeah. What's your thought about side projects?
Want to elaborate, or just like what I think about them?
Yeah, just like, I guess it just warms my heart. I just get excited when I see people doing side projects. I just think it's so awesome to, rather than trying to, oh, I'm going to quit my job or I'm going to go back to school. It's like, just try something in a relatively low risk way. You don't have to quit your job. Like, you want to be a writer? Okay, well, write a short story. You want to be a filmmaker? Well, start making some short videos. Or you want to be a, just start a podcast, write a blog, start programming on the side. You don't have to like switch careers first. Just test it out. Do some kind of experiment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, my thought on side projects are, first of all, are you acknowledging that your desire for it is to be something else? So that's your point. If you're going to start writing as a side project or do a screenplay, and your hope is to be a filmmaker or be an author, then you have to acknowledge that. And your side project is actually not just a side project. It's in many ways the embryonic beginning of your new career and your new identity that you're going to step into. That's a totally different aspect than my friend who is an incredible painter and has no delusions or aspiration to be a painter. He just paints when he comes home from work, and he does it for the love. And sometimes he sells some paintings, and sometimes he can, I ask him to make one for me, and I'll give him some money, or we'll do a mate deal. And so that to me is a different energy or intention that is coming with making or doing something as a side project. So my first point there would be side projects are awesome as long as you're clear on like, your intention. And then the other one is like, what do you stand to lose by not doing it? So whether it is the podcast or whether it is pottery, maybe it's just the cathartic process of doing that. So someone I spoke to yesterday is enjoying burning wood and making cabinets with this sort of Japanese technique. I was like, oh, you're going to start making cabinets and sell them? He's like, no, I'm just enjoying doing it. It's like I'm a child again. I'm innocent. So I love that because that's a break from running his company.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm totally a fan of side projects. I've had several of them. Several of them have died. Some have become mini businesses. Some have become projects. I think getting started and getting going is usually a good tactic. So I'm a proponent of the side project.
Do you have some kind of process that you work with your clients on for like an annual planning or annual review or quarterly review or some sort of peer? You can tell I'm maybe more on the prickly side.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of periodic self-assessment that's maybe helped guided by you? And if so, tell me what that looks like.
Yeah. Well, I can acknowledge that that's probably not my strong suit when it comes to, quarterly reports and KPIs and in academic land, like a threshold concept of we wanted you to get to this level of learning, and here's how we reverse engineered it, and we can reflect back. So there's work to do that in coaching land for me to level up. But what I do currently, I do a coaching program with many people all at once, and we do you to think, feel. Spring. So we just started it, and so the program will be done on July 1st. And so we track that. We capture it in a repository online, and then we revisit it, periodically every 3 to 4 weeks. So we'll do it sort of halfway through, and then we'll do it at the end. I do a version of that with my clients because I take notes and I have a pretty good memory. So for a recent client, who just stepped into a new job, we did, how do you want to feel in 1 month? How do you want to feel in 3 months? And how do you want to feel in 6 months? And the first sort of pillar is to be seen as or perceived as the expert. So that's an aspiration. The second pillar was to, I think, make a contribution or start a project. And the third one was to sprout. And so these were her words. So they're a little bit more gooey, but they're at least words of, like, for example, she said, I want to feel psychologically safe at my new company by month 3. Then I would make a note of that. We'd revisit that. But it wouldn't be something like, I want a job of 150K plus benefits by November 12th. Like that typically isn't happening in my coaching practice. But yeah, so there's always something being held and something being shared, and it's usually captured in writing and reflected back and brought back to review whether we got to where you had said you wanted to get to.
Awesome. Jonas, this has been great. If folks wanted to follow up with you, where would you point them online?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I have multiple identities. So jonasaltman.com is where you'll find me, like not physically, but digitally. Shapers.life is where you'll find everything about the book and the group coaching. And socialfabric.com is where you will find more about the work I do with organizations.
And we will include those links in the show notes. Definitely.
Yeah, perfect.
So Jonas, thanks so much for joining. It was really fabulous talking about you, talking about your book, Shapers. We will include a link to that in the show notes as well. Really appreciate the discussion.
Will, I've really enjoyed your questions. So thanks for an engaging conversation.